More to come, then we round this up. A few words about Muslim Arab frontier colonies. As I already explained, this was instrumental in establishing a permanent presence. There has been some work or a body of research on that, most notably by Belenitsky, Bentovich and Bolshakov in 1973. They published Srednjevekovy Gorod Srednje Asia, which is actually a portrait of transformation of city, in this case Merv, that is a prime case study, also a few other places, after the arrival of the Basran, Kufan and Yemeni colonists, which brings up a number of relevant insights in that process and in the way it was transformed. A number of things. What they observed is specifically a change in market culture, in the way the markets were being organized. Also irrigation, governance systems, the appearance of mosques in the streets, etc., because that was an important landmark of their visible landmark of their presence. A second thing is that contrary to Alexander the Great and his followers, his army, the Arabs did not actually establish or substantially refurbished cities. I mean, Alexander the Great did many, right? There's Alexandrias all over the place, from Egypt to Khojant. Khojant was also once called Alexandria Escata, if I'm not mistaken. Alexandria on the limits. That is what it means. Not so with Arabic invaders and with their system. They actually settled near cities or in existing structures. Nonetheless, what you observe from then on, and that may ring a bell for actual current relevance, is that cities became the turning plates for their political, ideological project. Not so much the countryside. What you will see is that cities were the first to actually be sociologically Islamized. Because a number of factors which we'll treat in detail then, which is the most important wing of this part of this lecture. Not countrysides. In fact, for many years, hundreds of years later, you will see that people in the countryside continue to profess the old belief system, the old religions, the fire worshipping or the local and micro-regional belief systems. Cities or Islamizations started clearly in the region's cities. And why is that? It is exactly the duplication of a pattern that happened in Western Arabia at the time. The Islamic movement, it started among urban merchants, not among farmers, yes, or small tenants, not in the agricultural sphere. The Islamic movement was a movement that started among merchants based in cities. Cities, again, which had a totally other dimension and site and population than what you imagine in a city today. Now, having said that, since we are talking about key dynamics, we come actually at the most important chapter of the lecture. That is one that explains the sustainability of Islam's presence in the region and the way it got closely intertwined with wider patterns of identification like ethnic, genealogical, etc. The indigenization of Islam. Then the process of conversion, because that is maybe a question, why did people eventually, despite the military aggression that they succumbed, the damages that were caused, why did they eventually adopt the ideology and the faith? There's a number of explanations, popular and lesser known explanation about it. This. If you look for a concept and literature about that, there's a gentleman here, Alan Strathern, who established a typology, or actually who identified 3 sets of motivation for people to convert. In the work you see there, you have the bibliographical references in detail. Voila. Which is what you want to photograph and not me. Actually, what Strathern did, he examined the historical conversion motivations among elites, among rulers. Because that's where it often started. Local dynasties, local rulers that then went over or adopted a new ideological order. But they are also, in my opinion, relevant for sub-elites and for certain professional categories, even for parts of the grassroots in the conversion and indigenization process. One set of motivation that Strathern identifies in his work is the so-called secular attraction. That is the window of opportunity opened by conversion, by the adoption of an ideology and faith. Huh? Now people may think, and this is actually a very popular explanation to explain the spread of Islam in Central Asia. You know, rulers, even people, professional categories, they converted to Islam out of like cynical, calculated opportunism. Huh? You adopt ideology or you pay lip service to it, then you can have power, posts, compensation, you can be exempt of tax systems, etc. Taxation. What happened very often is that under Muslim rule in Central Asia, even though the majority of the population professed other faiths and ideologies than Islam, they were given the status of dhimmi. Yeah? In exchange for a tax, they could profess their old religions and keep their courts and their juridical systems, etc. But they had to pay a tax for that. So that's often put forward as an explanation. You converted to Islam, you were exempt of taxes. First of all, the latter was not true. There has been a sort of conflict that exploded in 748-51 during the Abbasid revolution, the nevralgic center of which was situated in Central Asia. Secondly, conversions because of cynical, calculated opportunism did happen, but I think it's not enough to explain the sustainability of Islam. Because if it's sheerly calculated, if it's opportunistic, yes, then you leave the ideology once the system that propagated ends, once the rulers are gone, once the invaders disappear for one reason or another. And there Strathern says the same. It was more than cynical calculation. It had also to do with changing patterns of life due to trade that changed, offices that were held, general interaction in daily life with physical representatives of the new ideology. Second set of motivations that are also relevant in our case in Central Asia, the sedentary Central Asia. This is what he called demonstration of imminent power. Then again, people think, the forced conversions, demonstration of imminent power. So, yeah. That's also a popular explanation that is being put forward to explain conversion pattern. People were forced by the sword, by either the threat of physical violence or because they were afraid that physical violence that happened to others might happen to them. The conversions by the sword. Did that happen? Certainly. Yeah. Does that explain the sustainability? No. For the same reason, forced conversions rarely last beyond the direct presence of those who led them, who carried them out. By the way, the same is said about Christianity. Yeah? Lots of peoples in Europe were converted to Christianity because they were forced to do so by the Latin Church and its armies, etc., affiliated armies, etc. Okay, the instances happened that has been documented, but in my opinion, it's not enough to explain the full cultural transformation that you have. No, demonstration of imminent power has to do with something else. Mostly it occurs when the old belief system and the old societies are in a deep crisis. And this is what happened with Zoroastrianism, fire worshipping during the Iranian civil wars, where you saw that the official institutions could not deal with the new situation and were then in a legitimacy crisis. Second explanation, that is that the fire worshipping culture and the Iranian order and Iranian cultures, they had a caste system. You know what it is, a caste system, yeah? Mostly you associate it with Hinduism, but it existed in pre-Islamic Iran and even after that too in Zoroastrianism. Differently than in Hinduism, but it was there. Now, for many professional categories like soldiery, military partly, merchants, etc., they played an important role in daily life, but they had low social status. So there was frustration. And then in this conflict that they found maybe answers in the at least theoretically egalitarian message of Islam. I say theoretically egalitarian because the only hierarchy that is recognized in Islamic political theology is that of the believers, yes, and that of the forebears, etc. But in practice, stratification were present in Islam, even many forms of racism, etc. In the case of Moorish Umayyad Spain, this has been documented by Serafin Fanjul and other historians who challenge a bit that over-idealized image of what Muslim Spain was. And then the last set of motivation has to do with state building and disciplining society. I mean, disciplining, the association that may come up is disciplining people with the whip, you know, but that's not what we're talking about. Disciplining society is internalizing state legitimacy among people and regulate behavior. As that changed completely, you were integrated in a political space, you wanted access to a certain political space, this is what played as well. I mean, you've been in a museum close to the cathedral a few days ago, yes? And there at a certain moment, you had the date 966, if I'm not mistaken, the official Christianization of Poland. And it was mentioned there, I found it very good in the explanation, it gave Polish rulers access to the Christian, Central and Western European sphere. And that meant also allies. That meant also sources of legitimacy. This is exactly what happened then once Central Asia, or Iran and Central Asia were incorporated in the Umayyad and certainly then in the Abbasid empires. By the way, there is no country, modern country in Central Asia where the official adoption of Islam is celebrated. It just happened, is a historical background, but there is no set fixed date. It has been more set with the Islamization of the Mongol dynasties, where there are specific years that have been identified when the Khan of the Golden Horde or the Ulus of Chagatai converted to Islam, the first Khan that has been. But nowadays, it's not integrated in the nation building process of the modern nation states in Central Asia. That is the difference. Very well. Now, if we go to the process of indigenization of Islam, we already discussed enclave Islamization. That is not enough to explain why the pattern, the confessional geography of Central Asia changed, why it became the majority ideology confession among the Central Asian peoples and societies. We have a process of indigenization still to be examined. Patterns of enclave Islamization can actually be observed nowadays in present history. In fact, it is happening now in Western and Central Europe. Yeah. When you talk about, you know, because this is also some derived relevance of the whole discussion of Islamization, there is a perception that there is a process of Islamization going on in Western and Central Europe, right? In fact, if you ask, if you ask the question, is that occurring? Not through indigenization, because there are white Western European converts to Islam, but there are very few. There are more subcultures, right? It's not a substantial movement. But when you look at the situation in certain urban areas, there we are again, you will see through the building of parallel societies and through political clientelism that this process of enclave Islamization is going on. Through the dynamics of migration, how the political system works and that. Yeah? See the relevance of medieval history, how it can help understanding certain things, all the way into our current period. Now, when we go back to what is of interest here, the indigenization of Islam. I think that's been instrumental, not only me, but I mean generally it is accepted that this has been instrumental in the Islamization of the region. Not so much the presence of the Arabs militarily with their frontier colonies, but at a certain moment you see that the championing of the Islamic cause is being taken over by people who are not Arabs, or not purely Arab, who have only a partial affiliation or no affiliation with the Kufan, Basran, Yemeni colonists. They may have partly due to mixed marriage, etc. And you see gradually the emergence of an Iranian Muslimness. Again, Iranian, you have to understand that differently than modern Iran. An Iranian Muslimness embedded in Iranian culture that, through different forms, was dominant in not only Iran, but in Central Asia. And then there are a number of processes and actors that played a crucial role in there. And which one are they? I identified the following 6. The first one are heterodox and mystical and militant movements. Minority Islamic movements that came into being quite early in the Islamic period due to a process of internal split following civil wars, the legitimacy of the caliphate institution, etc. Heterodox, mystical, and at times very militant movements. Now, you may say, but there's Sufism coming in, okay? The Sufis, the mystical movements, which you have both in Sunni and Shia Islam, which are believed to have been champions, prime carriers, vectors of the message of Islam in Central Asia. No, we're not yet talking about that. Sufism became important later on in phase 4 of Islamization, where you see the emergence of specific schools of Sufi Islam that originated in Central Asia. Urgench as an important center of Sufism, the Naqshbandiya, which came into being in Bukhara, etc. You know that story. It comes later on. Here we deal with a different kind of groups. There were groups that split off from mainstream Islam, very political militant character, quite early on, and who either fled for persecution or decided to install themselves in the periphery or were sent to the periphery, just to ensure an Islamic presence there. The latter is very typical for classical empire. Yeah? If you have restive minorities in the core of the empire, what did many rulers do? They send them to the borderlands. So they were rid of the troublemakers and they can help ensure the presence there. And this is what happened with the caliphal empires as well in different phases. So what you saw quite early on, either embedded with the colonists from Kufa, Basra, and Yemen, and also among the Mutakilun, the warriors, the Arab warriors, some of them were followers of militant or heterodox sects within Islam. The Khariji, for example, which were very literalist in their interpretation of the Quran, some say they are predecessors, far predecessors of Salafism and Takfirism, yes, they were among them. They installed themselves in Merv, they installed themselves in Zaranj, which is now in eastern Iran. They had strongholds there, they were present. There were other, like the Hassaniya, the Qaisanids. They were then different. They were Shia, you know, the two schools, major school in Iran. They were not only Shia, but they already managed early on to get a number of converts among the Iranian population, because they proposed a mixture of Islamic ideology and specific Iranian elements. So they already had more common language. Minority groups, they were numerically quite small, but high fervor, very militant, and at times also very violent, especially the Kharijis. And they were present in that borderland that was Central Asia. Sometimes it has been documented as far as Otrar, which is now in southern Kazakhstan, near in Jambul province. What? Yeah, it's there. That was already quite far into Central Asia, but they had their communities there as a forepost. They played partly a role in that process of proselytizing, of conversion. Second, militarized proselytizing. There again, we have the question of proselytizing missionary work by the sword. You show your military strength, you terrorize the population, and then they're all afraid and they submit themselves. Okay, that has happened. There are instances about that. Again, insufficient to explain the process. What is more relevant here in militarized proselytizing is that especially in phase 1 and phase 2, also phase 3 differently, the institutional framework of Islamization was dominated by people with a military profile. In fact, military, so warriors, people who were involved in warfare, were among the sociological categories. I don't like to use classes, that has another connotation. Were among the sociological categories that belong to the earliest converts of Islam also, together with merchants and traders. Yeah? Two institutions and groups that are relevant therein, and military institution. The first were the so-called mawali. That is a word from Arab, and it originally meant auxiliaries. So military personnel that helped the Arabs, some would call them collaborators, yes, that helped the Arabs with their conquests. So local auxiliary units. They were already representing a first indigenization of Islam, the typical military caste. The second, and that has been well documented by Etienne de la Vessière in his work on the fortifications already in the Umayyad period, the Abbasid period, and then the Tahirids, were the so-called ribatun. A ribat is a fortress, but you can imagine that every frontier area has fortifications, fortresses, just for physical protection, but they had also another role that they played. That was mostly these fortresses had mosques, they had a marketplace, they had caravansarais, so motels, all these functions that were derived not specifically military, but that were sociologically very important. And what you see, for example, in the work of Deborah Tor and Etienne de la Vessière, is that these fortress lines were foreposts of an ideological project. In fact, comparable the way the Roman limes were along the Danube, the Rhine, and then in Africa, the Roman province of Africa, was exactly the same. It was just not military, there was an economy around that, and they were actually representatives of a new political ideological order. So that's what I mean with the thoroughly military character of Islamization, of what they call dawah, that is the spread of the Islamic message. The role of receptive rulers and categories. Here again, there were certain professional social categories that for a number of reasons, social aspiration, personal contact patterns, etc., were more receptive to Islamic ideology than the others. The same with rulers. For many centuries, local rulers, even non-Muslims, were co-opted in the governance system. At the end, a certain moment, like in Al-Khwarizm, it has also been documented in research, at a certain moment, you see that some of these rulers start to adopt a new ideology. In fact, you may think that rulers, local rulers working for the caliphs, were among the first to convert. It was not true. I mean, for about 70 to more than 70 years after the arrival of the Arabs and the putting of the protectorate there in Al-Khwarizm, the rulers there, local native rulers, remained fire worshippers or professed their local and micro-regional beliefs. But then again, this is then the process of secular attraction that plays, which I explained then further before. Furthermore, the critical mass of the emergence of a critical mass of non-Arab converts and indigenous intergenerational Muslims. That is important. Non-Arab converts. There's a number of groups that already manifest themselves quite early on. Warriors, the military, the so-called mawali, they were among them. The second are people born from mixed marriages. Remember what I said about the colonists. Many of them were single men, mutakilun. What they did then, when the time or when their warfare was over, they married indigenous women. So they had children. In most of the cases, they had children who were products of two cultures. And Muslim through the father line, because that's how it goes, right? So already they were people who embodied genetically and culturally these two cultures. Partly Arab, partly indigenous. And they would then form the base, further base for lineages of indigenous Muslims. The same with the converts here, who then, as time went by, got children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, who carried that Muslimness with them. So you had already the genesis of a base of regional converts and intergenerational Muslims. Also up to these days, you have families who take pride in a genealogical lineage of being Ashraf. Yeah? Ashraf, that are families who claim an Arab ancestry or any genealogical relation to the Prophet Muhammad or one of the caliphs or the early companions of the Prophet Muhammad. In Central Asia, you have families who carry that title, not officially, but in any case, in the family lore, it is present. This, my friends, would not stay without political consequences, because as time went by and this base of non-Arab Muslims grew, they would, in the end, demand a proper political representation in a system still dominated by Arabs or people of Arab lineage. Secondly, it's not because they were converts to Islam that they were always exempted from taxes in the Islamic order. Thirdly, they resented a lot the despise and the racism among Arab Muslims towards people more recently converted to Islam, which was very present there. In the end, the political result was a very important event occurring roughly between 748 and 752. That was the Abbasid Revolution. The Abbasid Revolution, which started in Iraq, in the core of the Islamic world, but most of the followers of which were situated in Central Asia, by then called in Al-Khurasan and Bilad al-Mawara an-Nar in the Arab caliphal order. It was this revolt, this movement, that would eventually bring a new dynasty of caliphs to power, the Abbasids. And from then on, you see that in the new Abbasid Empire, the new Abbasid order, you will see much more people from Central Asia and Iran represented in the elites. Especially the administrative and the intellectual and the governance elites. Less the military, that remained more in Arab or the upper echelons of the military. But the rest, strong Iranization of the elites. Etienne Lavessière has made also a study about the presence of Central Asians among the elites in Samarra at that time, which was temporarily the capital of the Abbasid Empire in Iraq. They were well represented there. The Iranization of the Islamic order. Different than from the previous one, the Umayyads, which were more looking towards the Mediterranean. And they were Syrian-based, and they looked more towards North Africa, the Berbers, Spain, etc. That was more their habitat. The Abbasids, no, they were getting more and more Iranianized. And then, this is what brought Central Asia in an economic space, the contours of which you can see here. That whole thing, that ideological empire, was held together by an ideology based or framed in a confession. It also translated in the formation of a new economic empire in which part of Central Asia would be integrated. At that time, you have a period where Central Asia will look to the west, westward, this direction. It's west, southwest, voila. But then within the Islamic space. The Abbasid economic space, that meant a thing. Common monetary system, common language. Arabic becomes the lingua franca of the empire. Also a confessional lingua franca. What you also have within the Abbasid period, that is the codification of Farsi, Iranian, as you know, which then is being given a modified Arabic alphabet, the coming into being of Farsi. Strong representation of Central Asians. Then later phase, you will also see more and more Central Asian in the military establishment. Because what happened is that the caliphs, and it's all typical for empire, right? They had their armies, but they had also their elite units. And from a certain moment onwards, they recruited these warriors, these soldiers, among groups from the periphery. And you will see more and more Turks and Caspian people being recruited in the Mamalik, or the Mamluks. They were an elite unit, a sort of Praetorian guards. Yeah? In Rome they had the Praetorians, the elite guard of the emperor. Here you will see the same with the Mamluks, the Mamalik, in the personal guard of the caliphs. And in that position, you will see that people of Central Asian origin, Turkic then, gain more and more power at the central level. Which led then, once Central Asia got incorporated in the Abbasid economic space, what you see is the revitalization of these trade routes between Central Asia and the Mediterranean. Voila. It went up and down throughout history, but you know, you have a common political space, new possibilities for trade, for transport connections, etc. This is what happened. This was actually a new impetus to that old, what they call Silk Road system, although they didn't call it that way at that time, but this is what happened then. And finally, in the political realm, the governorate dynasties. That is the autonomization of Central Asia and the acquisition of civilizational autonomy of Central Asia during the Tahirid and the Samanid period. What happened there? What do I mean by governorate dynasties? That was a process whereby rulers in Central Asia and parts of Iran who were appointed governor. You know what a governor is, provincial governor, by the central level, gradually gained more and more political autonomy. Up to all levels, even financial policy, coinage, etc., legitimacy, etc. Nominally, they remain part of the imperial system, but gradually you will see that they will start to lead independent emirates. Emir, emirate, an emir was actually the name, one of the names given to a governor, a representative of the caliph, the al-amirun. That is where the word comes from. Now, the Abbasid Empire, enormous as it was, you can see in the map, as all large empires do, sooner or later they start to get weak. They start to disintegrate because of their sheer size, because of varying quality of governance, etc. But when you have an empire, all these territories, these marks, these frontiers, etc., it makes you strong until a moment that the maintenance of that empire and all these bureaucracies and these vassals, etc., becomes really expensive. And then when you get into an internal crisis, the sheer weight of the empire can be fatal for the empire itself. I mean, history is literally littered with empires who disintegrated that way. And the same happened with the Abbasid Empire and the Abbasid caliphs, where the actual influence gradually shrunk to modern-day Iraq, modern-day Kuwait, and bit parts of the Persian Arab Gulf. And then you saw the emergence of these governors who more and more started to rule over independent emirates. There are many instances. For example, in the west of the empires, you had already a proto-Kurdish entity, the Hamdanids, who emerged. You had also Shia emirates who emerged. And in Central Asia, then the Tahirids and the Samanid emirates, these two. Now, the Tahirid emirates still function within the Abbasid Empire. What you had was more a devolution of power, decentralization, similar to what the Romans did at a certain moment with their empire. That you had 4 rulers, the tetrarchy, and later they had 2 Roman empires. then the western one, and then the eastern one based at Constantinople, present-day Istanbul. So the administrative decentralization. This is what happened with the Tahirids. Now the Tahirids are an interesting case because there are authors who say that was already a first attempt to re-establish Iranian independence. Not yet, not yet, not yet. It still quite functioned in terms of tax flows, legitimacy, well within the Abbasid order. But you see more and more autonomy and autonomization. Also in terms of raising their own armies, issuing their own money, etc. How did I see that archaeologically? You see in a certain period the inscription on the mints start to change. That's a typical indicator. The real re-establishment of an independent entity came with the Samanids, who originated in the area around Herat. They were initially Dahakin, landowners. Many Central Asian languages still have the word Dekan, which is a farmer. But Dahakin traditionally also referred to, well, farmers with a certain amount of land. So they were not hiring it, they were possessing it, the Dahakin. And there were initially local governors who gradually, because in the vacuum left by the shrinking of Abbasid central influence, gradually established their own emirate. Initially then based at Samarkand, later they moved to Bukhara. And that has been totally the engine of further Islamization of Central Asia, because it took over that whole project of championing the Islamic cause. We're no more talking about Western Arabia and the Red Sea. We're even no more talking about Kufa, Samarra, or then Baghdad, as it was founded as the Abbasid capital. That had shrunk to a limited area. It still got symbolic legitimacy, but then you have a situation where the Samanid dynasty takes over totally through the double jihad, the cause of Islamization of Central Asia. The sedentary areas, certainly, but also the beginning of Islamization of the nomadic and semi-nomadic population, which were also part of their territory, of course. What you see is double jihad, the ideological, intellectual one. They create the political conditions to do that, and also through the fortification system that they inherited from the late Abbasids, through the military institution and militarized channels. Note the irony: the Samanid Emirate legitimates a secular nation building project in Tajikistan, whereas it was a very important engine of Islamization of Central Asia throughout history. Then again, a very important period, because it is one of the periods that Central Asia, at least according to Wilkinson, and I agree with him, acquires civilizational autonomy. It becomes a center, a turning plate in its own right, then under the Tahirid and especially Samanid dynasty, and a center of the Muslim world rather than a periphery of it. Voilà, I think we have the essentials in that field. I will leave it at that and then leave it on your turn for remarks and questions.